Hello everyone and welcome to the Master and Drum Whiskey Room. My name is Jason C. and today we have a special episode about my beginner's guide to bourbon. With bourbon being so popular today and so many different bottles on the shelf, it's really easy to get overwhelmed and confused on where to start. There are a lot of misconceptions on what bourbon is, how it's made, and where to start. I've been a bourbon and whiskey enthusiast for about 5 years now, and I'm excited to help you start your approach into America's native spirit, bourbon. So first, let's start at the beginning. What is bourbon? Well, all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. Sound confusing? Well, for a whiskey to be called a bourbon, it has to follow a very strict set of rules. Rule number 1, made in America. Not just Kentucky, bourbon can be created anywhere in the United States. With popular distilleries all over the United States these days, bourbon is more popular than ever and new craft distilleries are creating delicious bourbons all over the place. In 1964, by Act of Congress, bourbon was recognized as a distinctive product of the U.S. and America's native spirit. So if someone tells you that bourbon can only be made in Kentucky, there are delicious bourbons from Texas, Colorado, New York, and more that they could be missing out on. Rule number 2, the barrel. For a whiskey to become a bourbon, it must be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel. Charring the inside of the barrel allows the whiskey to get deep into the layers of the oak as the barrel ages over time. Now, Mother Nature plays a huge part in how bourbon ages in that barrel while sitting in a warehouse. When it gets hot, the wood expands, allowing the whiskey to find its way into those deep layers of oak. When it gets cold, the barrel contracts and pushes all that whiskey out of the grooves and back into the center of the barrel. So when that brand new clear as water distillate goes inside that brand new charred barrel, the wood chemically changes the whiskey's color while adding those iconic caramel, vanilla, and fruit flavors to the whiskey while it becomes bourbon over time. Rule number 3, corn. Now, in order for a whiskey to be called a bourbon, it must be made with at least 51% corn. Corn's natural sweetness and bold flavor is what gives bourbon that unmistakable character. So if 51% is corn, then what's the rest? Traditionally, rye or wheat is the second most dominant grain in a bourbon. Rye adds a spicy and peppery note to the bourbon, while wheat is a softer grain that imparts some more sweetness and a smoother finish. Lastly, malted barley is used, which imparts a little flavor but is mostly used for the enzymes that help convert starch to sugar in the fermentation process. Now, all these grains all make up something called the mash bill. The mash bill is the breakdown of the exact percentages used in a specific bottle of bourbon. Typically, a mash bill could look like this: 75% corn, 15% rye, or 10% malted barley. A bourbon using wheat instead of rye could look like this: 75% corn, 15% wheat, and 10% malted barley. Now, some distilleries will tell you their mash bill, and some like to keep it under wraps, but with so many traditional and craft distillers using different combinations of grains to make bourbon nowadays, you could find bourbons using 4 grains, 5 grains, 10 grains, oat, millet, quinoa, and anything else you could think of. But remember, if there isn't at least 51% corn in that combination of grains, you can't call it bourbon. Rule number 4 is distillation and proof. Bourbon must be distilled at no higher than 160 proof, and the reason for that is simple: flavor. If you compare bourbon to vodka, vodka is distilled to about 190 proof, which strips out a lot of flavor and basically makes it pure alcohol. Keeping bourbon at 160 proof or lower keeps that corn and grain flavor intact before it's ready to head into that barrel. Rule number 5 is entry proof. Before putting that brand new whiskey in a barrel to age, distillers must add water and proof it down to 125 proof or less. Before Prohibition and bottling became more of a common practice, distillers used to barrel their distillate between 100 and 103 proof, even though at the time, today's strict laws of bourbon were not even in place. This was done mostly in part because consumers would get their bourbon straight from the barrel, and it was a very drinkable proof. The additional water added before barreling to proof it down helps to break down the sugars pulled from the oak, bringing out a much sweeter profile at a younger age. Rule number 6, out of the barrel and into the bottle. When the distiller decides that the bourbon is ready and is done aging, whether it is 30 seconds or 30 years, because there is no law on age for bourbon, it is time for bottling. Warehouse conditions will take its toll on the bourbon and the barrel. Some of it will evaporate or leak out, and the bourbon that comes out of the barrel will not be the same proof as it is when it went in. So some of the time it gains proof and other times it loses proof, but when it's time to go into the bottle, it must be at least 80 proof or higher. Again, nothing can be added at this stage besides water, no color, no flavoring. The only color and flavor in that bottle can only come from the aging process in that barrel. You add anything except what Mother Nature provided, it becomes a whiskey and cannot be called a bourbon. So here's a quick recap of what makes bourbon, bourbon. Alright, so now that you know what makes a whiskey a bourbon, now it's time to go to the liquor store. And nowadays there are so many brands with so many labels stating a lot of different things. Let's take a look at common labels and what they mean so you know exactly what you're looking for the next time you go into that liquor store. If you see this on a bourbon label, it means that the whiskey is aged at least 2 years. It can also be a blend of more than one straight whiskey type, being bourbon, rye, wheat, corn, provided all the whiskey comes from the same state. Now, single barrels are some of the most popular bourbons on the market. This product is a bottling which consists of a bourbon from one specific barrel. Now, when purchasing single barrel bourbons, keep in mind there will be variances in flavors between barrels. Some labels actually will have a specific barrel number on the label to help you identify which barrel you have. So if you see another bottle next to it that has a different barrel number, that could possibly taste a little bit different than the other bottle right next to it. Cask strength or barrel-proof bourbons indicates that water isn't added to the whiskey after aging and prior to bottling. Typically, bourbons of this type could be anywhere from 106 all the way up to 140 proof, so proceed with caution. But bourbon with no water added can give you the experience of tasting a bourbon right out of the barrel, which is full of flavor and some of my favorite type of bourbons personally. So look at the proof on these bottles and make sure you're ready for that kind of alcohol punch and flavor. Chill filtering is a method in whiskey making for removing residue. In chill filtering, whiskey is cooled to between -10 and 4 degrees Celsius and passed through a filter. This is done mostly for cosmetic reasons to remove cloudiness rather than to improve the taste or consistency. But if you see a label that says non-chill filtered, you're getting more flavor, better mouthfeel, better aromas, and a more authentic bourbon experience. Sour mash refers to putting the already distilled bourbon mash back into your fermentation as a starter, almost like making sourdough bread. Sour mash is really used for flavor consistency for most distilleries and can be found called out on labels as well. Sour mash is typically used by a lot of distilleries, so calling it out on a label really doesn't say too much. So sweet mash is kind of the exact opposite. Sweet mash means only using fresh water, grains, and yeast in the fermentation process every time. So there is no using mash from a previous batch like with the sour mash process. It's actually harder and more expensive way of doing things. It's harder to be more consistent from batch to batch when using a sweet mash process, but you get a lot more flavor if you're successful. Bonded or bottled in bond bourbon is a result of the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, which was supported by the whiskey legend Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr., among others, ensuring the quality of any spirit labeled whiskey. Originally created to protect consumers from imitation whiskeys and dangerous additives since before the law was passed, whiskey was often colored or flavored with things like turpentine, battery acid, or even tobacco spit by rectifiers to give you the perception of age and quality in a whiskey. The Bottled in Bond Act stopped this practice and has its own set of rules that scream quality and value on the label. To be bottled in bond bourbon, a bourbon is aged for a minimum of 4 years under government supervision, distilled from one distillery by one distiller through one distilling season. The bourbon is also bottled at 50% ABV or 100 proof. Increasingly, NAS, or non-age statement bourbons, are hitting the market everywhere. However, if a product makes a claim that their whiskey is X number of years old, not a drop of whiskey in the bottling can be younger than that age statement. The product can be older, but it cannot be any younger. With whiskey, if a bottling is stating their whiskey is X number of years old, you can be guaranteed that it's at least that old. Small batch could mean 2 barrels or it could mean 2,000 barrels in a batch. There's no legal definition for the term. It really means the brand is batching barrels together for a more consistent flavor profile from bottle to bottle. So to a novice bourbon buyer, this may seem more interesting, but it's just a marketing term. Some other marketing terms to look out for are reserve. If something is labeled as reserve, it isn't really from any kind of reserve special bourbon stock. This is also a great word that they combine with some of the other terms like special reserve or even old reserve. Another word to look out for is handcrafted. That's another term that you see on a lot of different labels these days. Whiskey has become more automated over the years to the point where lots of distilleries that claim to still be handcrafted are controlled by one person on a laptop. That's not to say that there aren't some distilleries that still hand make their spirits, but you should be still suspicious of that particular term. Other terms to look out for on labels that are pretty meaningless are special, old, very, extra, and rare. These are meaningless marketing terms to get you to buy the bottle when compared to others on the shelf. Even limited or limited editions can be suspicious. Unless there's a specific number of released bottles mentioned, treat this claim with a grain of salt. Alright, so now you know what makes a bourbon and you know what to look for on a label. Now, let's get to my top beginner recommendations for all you future bourbon sippers out there. So the first selection is Maker's Mark, which is very accessible, a staple at any liquor store, coming in at 90 proof and an MSRP around 30 bucks. Really has a lot of corn sweetness, very smooth to drink, it's a real crowd pleaser. Also makes a great mixer. Now, Weller Special Reserve is made by Buffalo Trace and one of the best values in a wheated bourbon for flavor and price, coming in also around 90 proof and an MSRP around 27 bucks. The only issue is that Weller Special Reserve is not so easy to find in a lot of places and not always priced where it should be. So that brings me to my favorite pick of these three, which is Larceny. Not only because it's easy to find, but it's approachable, it's sweet, it's delicious, it comes in at 92 proof for a bit more flavor, and it's available for about only 27 bucks. So take a quick look at the breakdown of these three bottles. Next up are 5 choices that gets back to the standard bourbon mash bill with at least 51% corn, rye, and malted barley that anyone can start with. Buffalo Trace, Elijah Craig Small Batch, Four Roses Small Batch, Edwin Williams Single Barrel, and Wild Turkey Long Branch. All 5 of these come from some of the most well-known and best distilleries on the planet. Buffalo Trace is bottled at 90 proof and is a classic. It offers vanilla, caramel, honey, orange, oak, and some baking spices as well. For about 30 bucks, this bourbon has a flavor profile that tastes like something a little bit more expensive than it is. Next up is Four Roses Small Batch. Four Roses is known for using an array of mash bills and yeast strains to combine flavors to make excellent bourbon, and Small Batch is no exception. Bottled at 90 proof, this bourbon offers citrus, cherry, oak, vanilla, rich caramel, and a bit more spice on the palate. This bourbon has creamy mouthfeel and also can be had for about 30 bucks. Next is Wild Turkey Long Branch. Long Branch is a collaboration of Wild Turkey's creative director, actor Matthew McConaughey, and Wild Turkey master distiller Eddie Russell. Coming in at only 86 proof, Long Branch gives Wild Turkey a little bit more of an approachable gateway for beginners to enjoy the beauty of Wild Turkey rather than their higher proof offerings. This small batch Kentucky bourbon is refined with Texas mesquite and oak charcoals to give a little bit more of a complex flavor. This bourbon is filled with caramel, vanilla, orange, cinnamon, and a beat of that sweet Texas smoke. This bourbon kind of grew on me the more and more I sipped on it. I wasn't too crazy about it at first, but throw an ice cube in this bourbon and sweet flavors kind of jump out of the glass and make for a really good, unique experience for a beginner. MSRP of this bourbon is about 40 bucks. My fourth pick here is Edwin Williams Single Barrel. This has classic bourbon flavors of vanilla, caramel, oak, and some roasted peanut as well. Now remember, every single barrel bottle will have slightly different notes than the year or bottle before it. But the best part is that it's a great bourbon at 86.6 proof for the price at only 25 bucks. Now my favorite pick of the 5 is Elijah Craig Small Batch from Heaven Hill. Coming in at 94 proof and available for about 26 bucks, this bourbon is about as classic as it gets. Oak, caramel, vanilla, all those beautiful flavors that I spoke about earlier. It comes in at a really great proof point. There's a lot of flavor, a lot of depth to it. It's really easy to find, and it's a great for a beginner. Now my next 2 bourbons offer great sweetness and delicious flavor with a bit more of an oak influence from the barrel. If you want to try something a bit more oaky and complex, try Eagle Rare or Woodford Reserve Double Oaked. So Woodford Reserve Double Oaked has become a favorite of mine, and Woodford Reserve is also the official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby. Coming in at 90.4 proof, this bourbon is aged almost a full extra year in a second barrel to enhance the oak and sweet flavors. Oak, vanilla extract, chocolate, toasted marshmallows all jump out of the glass, while the flavor brings dark caramel, more sweet oak, some dark fruits, and a little bit of a leather characteristic too. If you want to dive into an oakier and more complex sipping experience, Woodford Double Oaked can be had for about 45 bucks, and it's absolutely delicious. Next is Eagle Rare. This is another offering from Buffalo Trace, which is bottled at 90 proof, but is also 10 years old. Eagle Rare brings cherry, honey, vanilla, caramel, and some really beautiful sweet oak flavors on the nose and palate. Now, while the oak isn't as prominent as in the Woodford Double Oaked, tasting a bourbon 10 years old will allow you to explore how a bit more age in a barrel can affect the flavor of a bourbon. It's super enjoyable, sweet, and a great value, around 30 bucks. The next bourbon I've picked are for all of you out there who want to try bourbon with a bit more spice. This bourbon is considered to have a higher rye content in the mash bill rather than most bourbons, and leaves a lingering peppery spice on the back of your palate. That bourbon is 1792 Small Batch from Barton. 1792 Small Batch is Barton's flagship bourbon and brings a great mix of sweet and rye spiciness. Coming in at 93.7 proof, this bourbon has a big citrus influence from the rye spice to go along with the vanilla, caramel, oak, and black pepper flavors. This bourbon does feel a bit stronger on the palate from that rye spice, which some people may not like, but if you like spicy and a lingering peppery finish, then this might be the bourbon for you to explore. This bourbon can also be had for about 28 bucks. And for my last selection, we have a finished bourbon. Now, finishing a bourbon is the process where the bourbon is matured in that new charred American oak barrel, and then it's transferred to a different barrel of a different origin. Typically nowadays, we see bourbons finished in sherry, cognac, rum, Cabernet, and even port wine barrels. So that brings me to my last selection for beginners, which is Angel's Envy. Angel's Envy is a port wine finished bourbon that's bottled at 43.3% ABV and offers a super sweet candy flavor that's extremely approachable for about 50 bucks. This bourbon has a ton of vanilla, sugar, fruit, and maple syrup that is enhanced by that port finish. Honestly, this bourbon is way too sweet for me, but in my experience, Angel's Envy has provided an easy sipping experience and has been a gateway for a lot of people into more bourbons, so I felt like I had to add it to the list. So there you have it, everyone, my list of bourbons for all of you out there getting ready to leap into the wonderful world of bourbon. I chose all these bourbons because with so many distilleries out there, there are a lot of different flavor profiles, but all of these selections come from really great distilleries. For all of you out there that want to dive in, you'll be able to really find something that you truly love and enjoy. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention and add is probably the most important thing. Some so-called bourbon experts or more experienced bourbon drinkers may tell you that the only way to drink bourbon is neat, meaning no ice, no water, no soda, or anything else. So just like this, in a glass with nothing else in it. Now, bourbon is meant to be enjoyed exactly the way you like to enjoy it. So if you want to add a few drops of water, an ice cube, mix your bourbon with ginger ale, Coke, or even lemonade, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, a few drops of water and ice cube will actually help open up your bourbon a bit and release some more flavor. Bourbon is meant to be enjoyed exactly how you want it amongst friends and family. Don't ever forget that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Mash and Drum for a beginner's guide to bourbon. Be sure to leave a comment below if you have tried any of these, if you have any more questions on where to start, or if you have any other bourbons you think I missed that might help you get into bourbon. Now, if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. Find me on Instagram and also find me on Twitter. All right, guys, so now that you're ready, what are you doing here? Go to the store, buy some bourbon, drink some bourbon, and find out what you like. And as I always say, it is not about the whiskey, it is the people you share it with. Take care.